Hey, we're part of the ending of the Sermon on the Mount series, which has been a great series, but they've kind of given us the most controversial part of the series. Jesus says some things in the Sermon on the Mount that would not play very well in today's modern pluralistic society. But in order to show you how controversial what he's about to say, we kind of want to lay a backdrop for how people think about Jesus, how people think about God in today's setting.
I've been able to see this controversy up close and personal, actually over Thanksgiving break. One of the things I had to do over break was take an apologetics survey. This was for my apologetic exam or class with J.P. Moreland. And what we had to do was go out. So I went to the Brea Mall on Saturday, and I had to ask people 10 questions about God, about Christ, about ethics and morality. And so what I did was, I did that on Saturday, and what I found was that when it came to Christ, the answers were all over the board. We had people saying he was the redeeming Son of God. We had some people saying he was a good guy with flaws. One person actually needed the clarification, Jesus of the Bible, to know who I was talking about. So answers really varied. But where we saw a lot of unity on their answers was actually with pluralism. One of the questions I asked was, do all religions lead to God? And even people who were self-professing Christians said yes. So pluralism, or this idea of inclusivity, is common throughout culture.
And the reason nobody balked at a survey on religion is because we're very religious people. If you take a look at world demographics today, people are incredibly religious. Take a look at some of these statistics. 1 out of every 5 people in the world would self-identify as a Muslim. On average, 1 new mosque opens each week in the United States. From 1990 to 2001, Buddhism has grown in the United States 170% and is the 4th most practiced religion in America. However, 67% of the world's population does not self-identify as Christian. So long as the topic is about religion and that Jesus is seen in a particular kind of way as this do-gooder, like a social worker who goes and helps everybody, then there's really nothing controversial about Jesus or what he has to say.
In addition to that, a lot of social critics are noticing the rise of what we like to call buffet-style or cafeteria-style religion, which is where people pull different aspects of multiple religions. They like to kind of create their own form of spirituality. And we see examples of this all over the place. Take, for example, Anthony Kronman. He's the former dean of Yale Law School, and he wrote a book called Confessions of a Born-Again Pagan. This is a massive work. It's over 1,000 pages. And he writes on the back sleeve what the purpose of this book was for. He writes, "We live in an age of disenchantment. The number of self-professed atheists continue to grow, yet many still feel an intense spiritual longing for a connection to what Aristotle called the eternal and divine. For those who do, but demand a God that is compatible with their modern ideals, a new theology is required." Think about what he's saying right there. People in today's society still have a longing for meaning outside of just this life. They want to connect with the eternal, connect with the divine, but they want to build their theology around their ideals. They don't want to have to shape their ideals around the theology. And Dad, you have another example of this.
Yeah, there's a woman named Ann Doe who writes for the New York Times, and her parents made this decision, much like in a cafeteria. We're not going to raise the kids one religion. We're going to raise them like in all religions. And so she writes about this in the New York Times. This is what Ann Doe says. She says, "My father filled our home with books and music, making sure we had information on the Quran, Hinduism, Confucianism, Quakers, and Jehovah's Witnesses. My mother took us to temple, cooked kosher, navigated us through the First Communion, all the while garbing us in the right clothes to match secular holidays. Both parents showed us that practicing is believing, yet there's always more than one way to believe." So these parents basically said, we'll take a little bit of Hinduism, we'll take a little bit of Buddhism, take a little bit of Christianity, a little bit of Jehovah's Witness. We'll even throw in some secular holidays because we're not going to just saddle our kids with one perspective. I had a friend of mine who's Buddhist, and we were talking, and we got on the topic of negative and positive karma. And I said to her, well, what do you do like with negative karma? And she said to me, oh, you see, I don't believe in negative karma. I just believe in positive karma. And I was like, did you write to the home office to get approval for that? You know, but that's kind of how we do that today, is we pick and choose, like in a cafeteria, of what we want. But that's not what Jesus does. So in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says something that shocks people and would really shock people today with these kind of and-do perspectives of religion. This is what Jesus says. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. Notice what Jesus is saying. Hey, there's a lot of different paths out there, and many of them, most of them, Jesus would say, leads to destruction. There's a narrow path, that's my teaching, that leads to salvation. So if you ignore my teachings, one, there's eternal destruction, and second, you're a fool to turn away my teachings. Now, you can imagine if that was Jason's survey at Brea Mall. What do you say about Jesus, who says you have to accept him or reject him, and if you reject him, you go to hell? How do you feel about that? That'd be a different kind of survey. But today, people are like, hey, I think Jesus is fine so long as he's a kind Buddha. But if Jesus is who he says he is in the Sermon on the Mount, we better defend that. We better know how to give reasons why we believe in the exclusivity of who Jesus is.
So as Christ followers, we need to accept Jesus' harder teachings just like we can accept the easier teachings. And we think Peter offers some great advice on how to do this. He writes in 1 Peter 3:15, "But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect." So, in today's pluralistic society, we need to be able to articulate the reason we believe that Jesus is correct when he says that there is the narrow gate and that not all religions lead to God. So this is really getting into apologetics. 1 Peter 3:15 is one of the staple verses for it. And we like to use a definition of apologetics that comes from Alistair McGrath. And this is because apologetics has a long history of being known as something that's more argumentative, instead of actually being a type of ministry that can help people get closer to God. So, Alistair McGrath writes, "Apologetics is not to antagonize or humiliate those outside the church, but to help open their eyes to the reality, reliability, and relevance of the Christian faith."
So there's two things to notice very quickly. One, you're seeing two generational speakers right now because Jason can actually read the small print on that monitor, and I have to turn around to see the big print. So just notice my shirt's tucked in, his shirt is tucked out. There's just small subtleties. But so this, I'm like, what are you reading? I can't. Okay, so Alistair McGrath says there's two parts of apologetics. One, there's your content. Absolutely, that's important. But your content is useless if there's not humility, if there's not gentleness. And we've seen a political season where people devoured each other rhetorically. What McGrath is saying is, listen, let's not do apologetics that way. Don't use apologetics information like a club. No, we don't want to start an argument. We want to start a conversation. And we have to do that with gentleness and with meekness. And we really advocate having positive, productive dialogues, not these bitter debates that we've been seeing in this last political season. So where do you start? Well, the way that we start is you first have to revere Christ as Lord in your heart. That's an individual decision. Remember what Jesus said, I want you to love me with all your heart, mind, and soul. So we need to think deeply about the things that we really do believe. It's not popular to say that Jesus is the only way to get to God. It's not popular to say that Christianity is exclusive, that it's not just one path to God, but it is the path to God. Well, over your season of walking with God, hopefully you become more and more convicted of the fact that Jesus is who he says he is, that he is the Son of God, and salvation is found in him alone. But that's a process where you need to search your own heart to know, why exactly do I believe Jesus is the only way to get to God? Because my professors say it, because my parents say it, because my friends say it, or is there something that I need to own when it comes to that? So we need to think about why do you believe these things? So Jay, how about a question for them?
So we've been saying that you should start with yourself for why you believe that Christ is who he says he is. So actually, let's take a minute right now. Give yourself 2 or 3 reasons why you believe Jesus is God. So start with that. Okay, so without hearing any of your conversations, I'm willing to bet that most of you put the resurrection of Christ as one of the top reasons you believe Jesus is God. So actually, can I just see a show of hands? How many people had some argument related to the cross and the resurrection?
Good.
Good,
Great.
and there's good reason for that. We know that Christ rising from the dead is the source and the act that validates all of his claims. So everything we know about him, his works, his deeds, even his claim from the Sermon on the Mount about the narrow gate, we know that that's authoritative because he rose from the dead. And not only that, we know that Paul agrees with us. In 1 Corinthians 15:14, he writes, "If Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith." So if we're going to be Christians who are out in the public square sharing our faith, including the ideas about the narrow gate and refuting the idea of the pluralism that's common in society that we've been sharing at the beginning of the sermon, we need to be able to articulate why we believe Christ rose from the dead.
So this brings up a great point in apologetics, that there's positive and negative apologetics. So positive apologetics is you state something. You get into a conversation and you say, hey, I believe God is like this, and a person will counter, and when they counter, it's negative apologetics. It's responding to their question. We could go outside the walls of this campus and all day long talk about the positive nature of who Jesus Christ is. I went to UNC Chapel Hill. I did all my grad work, my master's and my PhD. Not one person spoke ill of Jesus my whole time at UNC Chapel Hill. But when you start to say, but he said he's God, and he said salvation is found in him alone, well, you better have a way of backing that up, because people are going to look at you right away and think that you're arrogant and out of touch. So what are the proofs that we can offer to people? Well, surprisingly, we want to offer two different kinds of proof. This is William Lane Craig. He is research faculty here. By the way, a really cool thing just happened. Philosophers got together all across the world and said, who are the top 50 living philosophers that are making an impact today? Biola University had 2 in the top 50. They had William Lane Craig and they had J.P. Moreland. Yes, we're selected. And that's awesome. We came in. No, okay, we didn't come in. So this is what William Lane Craig says that I think is brilliant when it comes to talking about the resurrection and showing it to other people. This is what Craig says. There are really 2 avenues to a knowledge of the fact of the resurrection. The avenue of the Spirit and the avenue of historical inquiry. The former provides a spiritual certainty of the resurrection, whereas the latter provides a rational certainty of the resurrection. So this is what Craig is saying. There's 2 avenues to show that Jesus rose from the dead. I'm going to tackle the spiritual aspect, and Jason's going to tackle the historical aspect. But Jesus says, William Lane Craig says this, if Jesus is alive, you should have experiences with him. You should be aware of his presence. There should be answers to prayer when you prayed to Jesus. Let me tell you a powerful reason that I believe the resurrection is true. I was on staff with Campus Crusade for Christ, and they invited me to West Virginia University to be part of this panel. It was on religious diversity and the value of studying religion as undergrads. So I was there. There was a Buddhist monk there, a Hindu scholar, an imam. There was a New Age believer, and I was representing Christianity. And we were all sitting there finding common ground, having a great time. There was discussion about having a sleepover afterwards. I mean, this was awesome. We're having just the greatest time talking about the positiveness of religion. Well, there was a Q&A time, and the place was packed. And the first person who walked up to the moderator says to me, I used to be a Christian. And I was like, oh, this is just not going to go well. And he said, you're not telling us the truth. And I was like, what? He said, yeah, you're saying Jesus loves people, but you're not telling us the rest of the story. You believe that if a person doesn't believe in Jesus the way you do, that person's going to hell, right? People were like, no, not Tim. Oh, we like Tim, right? He said, so why don't you just tell the truth right now? Look at your Buddhist friend on that platform. Look at your Hindu friend on that platform, and you tell them exactly where that person's going to go if they don't subscribe to Christianity. And the moderator just looked at me and said, care to reply? And my response was, no, I'm good. So in that moment, I don't know if you've ever been booed by a whole auditorium. It is a horrible feeling. I prayed to Jesus right in that moment. And I prayed, give me confidence, give me a sense of peace, and give me graciousness. And so basically that Q&A time lasted for roughly a half hour, and all questions were directed to me. And I tried to be gracious, but I did say, listen, there's many things I believe that's true from Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam. But at the end of the day, Jesus is either right in what he's saying or he's not. But I experienced the peace of Christ. If Jesus wasn't resurrected from the dead, William Lane Craig is saying, then what did you experience? How many of you felt like you've experienced the peace of Christ at some point in your life? How many of you feel like you've prayed to Jesus and you got an answer? Raise your hand. Well, if Jesus is dead, where did that come from? Now listen, the response to that very quickly is, well, okay, but other people say they have peace in their religions, and what do you do about the Mormons who feel like they have a burning bosom, right? Well, okay, we'll have to talk about that. I don't just believe that Jesus rose from the dead because I experienced his peace, but it'd be really odd if Jesus did rise from the dead and I didn't experience his peace. Maybe some of us need to take time to cultivate that kind of interaction with God. So just know that your personal testimony is incredibly important, how you actually interact with the risen Christ. But that's not all we have. We also have great historical proof, right, Jace?
Yes. So William Lane Craig laid out 2 avenues for knowing that Christianity is true. Dad just covered the avenue of the Spirit, and I'm going to cover the avenue of historicity. One of the great things about Christianity is the fact that it's a historical religion. We know events happened, we have evidence, we have documents, we have eyewitnesses saying these accounts occurred. So specifically about the resurrection of Christ, there's a ton of arguments out there, way too many to cover in this chapel, but I want to focus on one of my personal favorites, which is looking at the apostles. So, as Jesus is arrested leading up to his crucifixion, the apostles are demoralized. The most famous example of this is Peter denying Christ 3 times, and it makes sense why they would be in this state of mind. In first century Judaism and in Roman culture, dying on the cross is the ultimate insult. So, as this is happening, the apostles are starting to doubt whether Jesus is the Messiah, and so they even start to return to their old lives. But after the resurrection, we know these same apostles turned into an unstoppable force that was for decades willing to go through persecution, arrest, even most of them were executed, preaching that Christ had risen from the dead because they were so motivated by seeing Jesus risen. So one of my favorite ways to illustrate this actually comes from an example of American politics. I'm a political science major, so it's what I like. The building on the screen, for those of you who don't know, was actually the building where President Nixon's aides were caught breaking into the Democratic National Party's headquarters, which famously became the Watergate scandal. So when this happened, the press started looking into it, other politicians started figuring out what had happened, but Nixon's aides, for the first 3 weeks, tried to maintain the lie that President Nixon had nothing to do with it, but they cracked. And the reason for this was they started to face persecution. The aides were starting to face jail time, so they actually turned on Nixon to save their own skin. But when you contrast this with the apostles, you get a much different story. So when you consider their account, and we know this from the book of Acts and other historical sources, that they went for decades preaching Christ's name. They were beaten, they were crucified, they were arrested, most of them were executed, and yet not once did any of them ever recant knowing or seeing Jesus rise from the dead. So my favorite way of seeing the contrast between Watergate and the apostles comes from Charles Colson. A lot of you know who he is. He was one of Nixon's aides who was imprisoned for the Watergate scandal. And during his time in prison, he actually became a believer, started prison fellowship ministries, and became a great leader of the church. And so he writes this: "I know the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified they had seen Jesus raised from the dead. Then they proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. They would not have endured that if it weren't true. Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. You're telling me 12 apostles could keep alive for 40 years? Absolutely impossible."
And they weren't facing death. They were facing prison time, loss of reputation, all that kind of stuff. The disciples are facing death. It's great you can borrow that from your political science major. I was a theater major undergrad, and so there's very little in mime class that just came to mind when I was thinking about those things. So what do we do now? Now we have to get into this moment of preparation if we're going to share the kind of Christ found in the Sermon on the Mount. And so we have to prepare on both levels of what William Lane Craig said. So some of us, feel like I don't have any experiences with Christ. I don't feel like I have this moment that I could identify as Christ giving me this peace that goes beyond all comprehension, Paul would say. Well, if that's true, then I think we need to pursue Christ. I think we need to have a game plan of how to pursue Christ. One of the best things about Biola University, in my estimation, is the spiritual formation department that we have here, because you can get a way of pursuing Christ. You can get office hours, you can go and meet with individuals, but have a game plan of, I want to interact with Christ on a deeper level. Let me recommend one book. It's called Renovation of the Heart by Dallas Willard, one of the last books the great Dallas Willard wrote before he died. It's a way of pursuing Christ through meditation, fasting, prayer, because we don't want to make up experiences with Christ if we don't really have them. But I think Jesus is offering to all of us a deep experience of his presence. So let's have a game plan of cultivating that for two reasons. One, you want to grow deeper with Christ, but also you do want to be able to say to people, listen, I'm utterly convinced Jesus rose from the dead because I've met him, I've experienced him. So let's prime that well a little bit and seek to pursue Christ.
And just like we need to continue to develop our spiritual relationship with Christ, we also need to develop the arguments we have for believing that Christianity is true. So on the screen are a list of resources that we use, and we encourage you to do as well. Now, apologetics can be an overwhelming field. There's tons of arguments and counter-arguments on every point. But we want you, and we want to encourage you guys to be well-versed in at least the basic arguments, and these are great resources to do so. So we have Reasonable Faith. That's by William Lane Craig, the same professor we've been talking about earlier. He has podcasts, lectures, Q&As on his website that are really helpful. Same thing for RZIM, which is Ravi Zacharias' ministry. And then there's a cool resource called the 1 Minute Apologist. It's these short videos that cover a lot of different areas within apologetics. But Dad, what's the one funny thing about 1 Minute Apologist?
So this is a friend of mine, Bobby Conway, who put together the 1 Minute Apologist. I think he fell in love with the name because none of them are 1 minute. Like, none of them. But they're great. They're like what, 3-4 minutes, 5 minutes? And you just punch in resurrection in the search engine, you're going to get like 15, 20 great, really short videos on the resurrection that can help you understand the historical proof for it. And then you get J.P. Moreland has a website that's awesome. Sean McDowell, one of our faculty in the Biola Apologetics program, put together the Apologetics Study Bible. So as you're reading the resurrection accounts, right, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, you can look at the footnotes, and it gives you great apologetic understanding of some of the other proofs for the resurrection. But here's one thing we want to suggest to all of you. I'm currently trying to get my black belt in Kung Fu. I'm kind of like having a midlife crisis and want to try to get my black belt. I became a Christian through karate, so I've always wanted to get back to it. But my instructor says this all the time. You can study these things, like how to do a block, how to do a kick, but it's in sparring that you really learn to do it. So take these ideas and actually get on the mat with a black belt, and you try to do it then, you learn these techniques. So we're really advocating for you guys, get out there and really engage in conversations with people. You recently had a great opportunity to do this.
I did. So in the last couple of years, I've taken an interest to apologetics and been studying it more and more. But last semester, I was asked to speak at a public high school at an event co-hosted by the Skeptic Society and the Christian Club on apologetics and the classic questions about Christianity. So I agreed to be one of the panelists, and I show up. Funny thing is, it was a panel of one. It was just me out there, so I had to answer every question that was asked. And there are times I certainly wish there were other panelists there. So it really did show me that there are areas I still need to grow in, and still need to develop certain areas of apologetics and questions that I didn't feel comfortable with. But on the other hand, I also saw how apologetics can be a ministry used to further conversations. The Christian leaders told me later that that event helped spur on further conversations with the skeptics and really move the conversation forward. So if you guys do put in the time to study these issues, it can be fruitful in helping bring others closer to Christ.
And what impact has that had on you studying those things and going out and doing it?
It was greatly encouraging. Even though I made mistakes, I saw that this was an avenue that can be important and that it's an area the church really needs moving forward.
Yeah, we did the exact same thing at Eastern Michigan University. We'd go into these dormitories with Campus Crusade for Christ, and we took God's greatest gift to the church, free pizza, with us. And we offered people free pizza in these dorms, and we said, listen, we're going to talk about God for 10 minutes, and you can ask any question you want. So as they're eating our free pizza, they'd say, well, what about those who never heard of Jesus? And we're like, another pepperoni? And then we all go back to do what everybody does. We go back and we call J.P. Moreland. We're like, JP, I have no idea how to. He says, okay, calm down. Here's how to think about that. So in closing, here are some thoughts.
You can't expect the Holy Spirit to bring into mind what you haven't studied. So what we really want to encourage you is that we see the Spirit moving in the prep time when you're studying and putting in the time, understanding these issues, and then the Spirit will help you recall those matters when you're actually out there conversing with others.
Yeah, not a great study technique. I'm just going to trust the Holy Spirit brings to mind in a test. And also, we just want to give the Holy Spirit information to do that. Last, let's have humility. Just because Christ is the only way to get to God doesn't mean that there's not truth in other religions. By the way, one of our faculty members, Dr. Greg Tunnelsoff, wrote a great book, just came out, called Confucius for Christians. In other words, we can learn from other religions, so let's be humble and let's be open to the thoughts of Buddha and the thoughts of other religious teachers, knowing in the end we have to depart, but there's some truth in those religions because God placed that truth in there. Well, we close with this. When his sermon was over, Matthew makes this very interesting observation. He says, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority. Listen, if you present the Jesus of the Bible, not the Jesus of pluralism, but the Jesus of the Bible, no doubt some people are going to be turned away, without a doubt. He's going to be seen as intolerant, and you're going to be seen as intolerant. But we believe via the Holy Spirit, when you present Jesus as he really is, people are going to be amazed at him, and the authority by which he speaks are going to draw people, not push people away.
Biola University prepares Christians to think biblically about everything, from science to business to education and the arts. Learn more at biola.edu.